Chapter 26. You're over, brother. As part of the ongoing war with Ted Turner, that November Vince pulled off a coup, wooing Ric Flair to his team, along with the actual WCW champion belt, which Ric brought with him like a captured flag. I would face Flair for the first time at the New Haven TVs on November 13th, and I was looking forward to finding out whether he was the best worker in the business, as all the marks and wrestling commentators generally declared. Flair was what my dad called a routine man, because he did the same match every night no matter who he worked with. He also liked to call every step of the match with little input from me. For a guy nearing 50, he was in great shape. Ric took his usual bumps and cut a blistering pace. When we talked before the match, he had suggested a finish that called for me to do a flying tackle where he'd catch me and stagger backward with the two of us toppling over the top rope only to be counted out for the finish, which would be a double DQ. It was a simple move that I'd done countless times with less skilled wrestlers, but at the end of the match, when I dove into Flair, he stood too far from the ropes, mistimed it, and didn't have the strength to catch me, so we fell down in a heap. On the spot, Ric came up with a makeshift finish that, not surprisingly, benefited him and not me. I wasn't going to make a big deal out of it, but back in the dressing room, I was annoyed to hear Flair crying to me about what happened on the finish, implying that I had screwed up. He showed me, right then and there, that he wasn't as great as he was supposed to be. I'd heard there were a lot of wrestlers who didn't trust or like Flair, and I was starting to see why. On December 3rd, I was in San Antonio, which I loved because I got to visit the Alamo and I always stayed at the historic Crockett Hotel right next door. After having a decent match with a relatively new arrival named Skinner on a one-time only pay-per-view called Tuesday in Texas, I zipped over to the airport in a rented Mustang convertible to pick up Owen, who'd flown in from Germany. I'd suggested to Vince that he could team Owen with Jim and call them the New Foundation, and Vince had gone for it. I was in a great mood as I pulled up to the terminal and spotted him waiting for me curbside with a big smile. I hadn't seen him for over a year. Most of the wrestlers were meeting at a strip bar after the show, one of our regular hangouts in San Antonio, and as we drove over there, Owen told me that things had gone well for him in Germany and that Martha was expecting their first child in March. He was happy to be back in the WWF and said he thought he could work well with Jim. I told him Jim was thrilled about it too. Jim was thrilled in general. He had finally won his settlement from U.S. Air, a whopping US $380,000. Owen asked me for advice on how to handle Jim, and I told him that I'd tried just about everything but that in the end it was reverse psychology that worked best. He shook his head as he told me how unbelievably over I was in Germany. I could tell it also meant something to him that I had the Intercontinental belt. We talked about home, about losing and missing Dean, and about Rhett's struggle in the hospital. The previous day I'd been to El Paso, where some buddies I called Cheech and Chong had given me a giant baggie filled with Mexican dirtweed. So of course it figures that before the tapings in San Antonio, Vince called a meeting to inform all the wrestlers that in a few weeks drug testing would be expanded to cover any and all non-prescription drugs, including marijuana. Vince said that with the FBI and the media waiting to pounce on him, the WWF couldn't take a chance on another scandal. I believed, and still do, that Vince's decision was short-sighted. With weed taken off the menu, even more wrestlers wound up as alcoholics. Instead of smoking a bit of weed holed up in their hotel rooms talking about the business, they roamed hotel bars drunk and on downers. I handed a big, fat joint to Owen and explained that it was probably the last time we'd be able to smoke pot for a while. Owen, so straightless most of the time, let his hair down, and we both took a few hits. We pulled up to the strip bar feeling good. Inside, a bunch of wrestlers crowded around Hulk at the far end of the room. Beefcake was there, having recovered enough from the parasailing accident to come back for limited duty. Unfortunately, with steel plates holding his face together, he could no longer wrestle in a serious capacity. Standing off to the side were Hawk, Animal, Kurt, Bossman, and Ray Hernandez, a muscle-bound Tampa powerhouse who worked a Hercules gimmick. I introduced Owen around, spotted Jim and Davey at a table, and ordered beers for us all. Vince came in around midnight. That was unusual enough because Vince didn't make a habit of hanging out with the boys. But what really turned heads was that Vince was shit-faced, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. Pat Patterson tagged behind him trying to persuade him that it was a bad idea to be there in his condition, but Vince had decided that he was going to have one last party with the boys before the new drug policy went into effect. Sergeant Slaughter offered to keep an eye on him and act as his designated driver, so Pat fled through the front door, as though he'd been chased out by the sight of all those naked women. Then I heard Hogan daring a wild-eyed Hawk into doing the LOD finish on Vince right there in the bar. Suddenly Animal crouched behind Vince, stuck his head between Vince's legs, and picked him up off the floor. Vince was laughing as Animal walked him over to all of us. Hawk had already climbed up on the bar, gripping a stripper pole, a shuddering hope that he was going to take Vince's head off. I thought, wow, he's actually going to do it, but at the last second Hawk thought better of it and leapt off the table, gently hitting Vince with his arm. Hulk and Beefcake caught Vince and set him on his feet to a round of golf claps from an assortment of ass-kissers who seemed to materialize on cue. I rolled my eyes at Jim, who boldly declared the Hart Foundation would have had the balls to do it. Damn right. I had a beer in one hand and a shot of JD in the other, but was conscious enough to think, my God, what did I just say? Owen's eyes got big. I considered running out of the place as I watched a determined Jim nonchalantly pick up a grinning Vince like he was jokingly hugging him. The boys parted before me, and Hulk stared as if there was no way I had the balls to do it. I set my drinks down, and before I could even think about it, I leapt high in the air, clotheslining Vince with a thud. His head bounced off the carpeted floor, his skinny neck stretched out like a turtle's. There we both were lying on our backs, and I thought, what have I done? You owe me a drink, Hitman. Vince drunkenly slurred. Don't worry, I'm buying. Double doers on ice. We tossed them down. Last call came and went and the lights came up, but nobody was leaving. Davey had Vince over his shoulders and was running around looking for a place to power slam him. The police were called to clear us all out. With Owen and an assortment of strippers in my car, we joined a train of about 30 cars about to head downtown for a party in Flair's penthouse suite at the Marriott. The procession couldn't get by a police cruiser parked in front of the strip bar, so Slaughter, with his big chin sticking out, burned the rubber off his tires as he pushed the cop car to the side of the road. At about 3 a.m., the drunken mob descended upon a young male desk clerk to call Flair's room. No answer, so Vince demanded a key. The flustered clerk said it was against hotel policy, but Vince cut him off. I'm Vince McMahon. Give it to me right now. He got the key. We all packed into the elevators and headed up to the 40th floor. We piled into Flair's room, waking Earl Heckner, the referee, who was asleep on a rollaway bed. Flair hadn't yet returned from his own night of misadventure, so we made ourselves at home. It was a beautiful suite with a full-sized bar, but the bar was stocked with only one full bottle of vodka. The party was about to die when a bag of dirt weed mysteriously appeared and joints were rolled and lit. I saw firsthand what the boys thought of Flair when everybody used his king-sized bed as a urinal, even Vince, stripped down to his boxers, black shoes and socks, and his tie. I remember Hercules and Kurt laughing as they hosed it down, and for some reason, I thought nobody would have done this to Harley Race. Then Vince got it in his head to have some fun amateur wrestling with us. When he came for me, I was careful and playful with him, as was Kurt. Then Vince took Hawk down and pinned him to the floor. When he grabbed Herc hurled Vince upside down into the air, but Vince somehow bounced off Earl's rollaway and landed on his feet. Vince gave Herc a sober glance that said, "In the morning, if I can remember any of this, I'll fire you." In fact, only days later Herc was released. Then Vince sized up Jim, a big rhino. "You're the only guy I haven't tried yet." Jim twisted the tip of his beard and asked Vince whether he'd ever seen that scene in Die Hard where Bruce Willis tackles some villain, and they both fall 40 floors down to the lobby. Vince nervously glanced at the window, knowing that Jim was crazy and drunk enough to do something like that. He decided to leave Jim alone. By sunrise, Flair still hadn't made it to his own party, and I was drunk and leaning on a stripper as she helped me get my room key in the door at the Crockett Hotel. That morning everybody had to drive up to Austin for the second day of TVs. Vince was red-eyed and red-faced, still clearly feeling the effects of his wild night. In his office I told him that he could hold his head up high for having the balls to hang with the boys for one last hurrah. And then I promptly went out and drew a big blackboard cartoon of Vince in his boxers pissing in Flair's bed. It broke everybody up, especially Vince. A few days later, Owen and I boarded a plane at LAX to go home. I took my usual seat toward the back of the cabin, where I found myself surrounded by an all-girl basketball team out of Chino, California. I was trying to read but was pleasantly distracted by their loud chant, "Who rocks the house? The Hitman rocks the house." I lowered my book and they gathered around, flirting and telling me they'd voted me the best-looking guy on the plane. I looked over at Owen and he just smiled and shook his head. We had Sunday dinner up at Hart House 3 days before Christmas. My mom was still worried about Rhett, who was a long way from being out of the woods. Hart grandkids scurried about the old house, and I wondered whether Rhett would ever be able to race around like them. It warmed my heart to see both my mom and dad smile when they passed me the current issue of Alberta Report magazine, which called me the most famous Albertan in the world. The following night I fell asleep next to Dallas in his bed, only to be woken by an angry little voice calling out in the dark, "Dad! Dad! Dad!" It was Blade. Julie and I reached him at the same time, at the top of the big stairs. He'd noticed I wasn't in my bed and thought I'd left like I always did. I felt a pang in my heart hearing him crying out for me. His tears stopped as soon as I scooped him up, and as I held him close I felt his heart beating fast. But on Christmas Day I was gone again. On December 30th, Roddy pulled me aside at the building in Bangor to tell me that he had some big news. Vince had told him that I'd be losing the IC belt to Jacques Rougeau, who now cartooned as the Mountie. The real RCMP had threatened to charge him with impersonating an officer, which grabbed a few headlines across Canada. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach as Roddy explained the angle. I'd supposedly come down with the flu, and despite gallantly trying to defend the IC belt against the Mountie, he'd beat me for it. Then Roddy would fill in for me 2 days later at the Royal Rumble, challenging the Mountie to an IC title match, and Roddy would win. After that, he dropped the IC belt back to me at WrestleMania 8. Roddy said he was giving me advance warning so I'd be prepared when Vince told me at the next TVs. I hauled my stomach out of my boots. Yes, I was losing the belt, but if Roddy put me over at WrestleMania 8, it would be the biggest thing to ever happen to me. The big contest coming up at the Royal Rumble would be Ric Flair against Macho Man. Flair had been working around the United States against Hogan, still wearing WCW's world title belt and calling himself the real world champion. To this day I don't know why Flair didn't have more consideration for his old colleagues still struggling in WCW. For Vince it was a chance to stick his thumb in the eye of Ted Turner, but Flair had to know how much the use of their belt would hurt his former wrestler colleagues at the WCW. Vince decided that the winner of Royal Rumble 1992 would automatically become WWF World Champion, and the boys assumed it was Flair whom Vince had pinned his hopes on to carry the territory, at least until the WWF's legal woes cooled off. I thought that if Flair won our belt, it would give too much credibility to WCW. The wrestling talent in the two outfits was comparable, but Vince's camera crew and post-production work were light years ahead of WCW's, which is saying something, because WCW did have Turner Broadcasting behind it. A week later, Vince finally told me about his plan for me to lose the IC belt and win it back. He also said that sometime in the fall I'd drop it to Shawn Michaels. He asked me whether I had any problem with that, and I told him, no, that I had a lot of respect for Shawn. Thanks to Roddy's heads up, I was able to tell Vince that his plan for me sounded terrific. He seemed relieved. So, on January 17th, in Springfield, Massachusetts, I walked out to the ring looking as sick as I could and dropped the IC belt to the Mountie. Despite knowing where it was all leading, I flew home feeling dejected about missing Royal Rumble and the payoff that would have come with it. My only consolation was a rare weekend off. As if all the bad press about steroids in the WWF wasn't enough, now allegations began to emerge about gay management preying on vulnerable teenaged boys in the ring crew. At one time or another most of us had seen Terry Garvin hanging around these young men, but none of us knew what, if anything, went on behind Garvin's closed door. Then a former member of the ring crew, Tom Cole, came forward in the San Diego Union Tribune with the alleged details. Vince was doing all he could to contain the scandal. On February 16th, we worked at Long Island's Nassau Coliseum. Jim wasn't expecting that there'd be a drug test, but there was. All evening long he stalled Chief and the Pecker Checkers by saying he was simply unable to pee. He also refused to put over one of the Beverly Brothers, a new team, and left the building that night having never taken the test. Vince was already pissed off with Jim because he hadn't paid him back for footing the legal bill in the U.S. Air suit, despite winning a big settlement. The next day at Tampa TV's, Jim was summoned to see an irritable Vince, who curtly fired him. Jim slammed the door behind him and went looking for Chief. When he found him, he grabbed a TV monitor and hurled it at Chief's head like a shot put. When Chief ducked, it hit a WWF television director in the leg. Then Jim burned rubber out of the parking lot. With Jim gone, they threw Owen together with Coco Beware, who had been hired back after his European misadventures, and renamed the team High Energy. Despite it being a lame idea, Owen stayed upbeat and full of that supposed high energy as he and Coco tried to get over as best they could. On the bright side, Martha gave birth to a baby boy. They named him Ouya, which was Owen's nickname when he was a baby. On March 4th, as a result of the allegations of sexual misconduct, Pat Patterson, Terry Garvin and Mel Phillips all resigned, though none of them admitted to having done anything wrong. Vince and Bruno Sammartino ended up debating the whole sorry mess on Larry King Live. It was too late to nail that closet door shut, and all sorts of people who'd ever had any kind of a falling out with Vince suddenly brought out their own stories of sexual improprieties. If I was looking for a vote of confidence, I got it at the Hojo's in Boston, from Harley Race. The WCW was in town, and as both crews of wrestlers hung out in the bar that night, The WCW boys hovered around the WWF ring rats like they were in paradise. Harley had found his footing again as a heel manager to a colossal, red-headed monster of a man named Vader, who wore a red leather mask that looked more like a jockstrap. Vader was now WCW World Champion and one of the biggest names in Japan too. I admired Harley, having battled back from divorce, intestinal surgery, a bad boating accident and bankruptcy to land a good contract with WCW. I was grateful when he pulled me aside, ordered me a beer, he no longer drank, and asked me whether I had plans to leave Vince anytime soon. I told him I'd be crazy to leave now, especially since WCW hadn't been very professional in their dealings with me thus far. Still, I sat listening quietly as Harley told me of WCW's plans to make a serious run at Vince, using Turner's money. The timing was perfect, he said, for me to land a big fat contract. Brett, you're the best damn worker in the business now. That was an amazing thing for a man as respected as Harley to say. I told him I'd keep his idea in mind, but the weird thing was that I was actually beginning to sympathize with Vince a little. Vince had been as cold and ruthless as a man could be, and it was now as though his harsh treatment of his wrestlers had finally caught up with him. I'd been in the WWF for 7.5 years, and in all that time I'd never seen Vince have anything whatsoever to do with what Terry Garvin and Mel Phillips were now suspected of. And the crippling accusations that he pushed steroids on his wrestlers seemed opportunistic. Vince made it clear that he liked his wrestlers to have good physiques, but that how you went about achieving that was your own decision. It seemed to me that all Vince was guilty of was looking the other way, but in that regard he didn't seem any different than the owner of any major sports franchise, or the Olympic Committee, for that matter. And Vince was the man who had brought pro wrestling out of smoky halls and small arenas and made it into family entertainment that crossed age, economic, gender, and national boundaries. We were now heroes, with our own action figures. Not only was it good for the fans but, even with a merciless schedule and being treated as a disposable commodity, the life I led now beat nickel and dime payoffs and traveling packed like a sardine in a frigid van with the sting of fresh gig marks carved into my forehead. If Vince went down, where would any of us be then? Sure, there were a lot of legitimate gripes, but I wish the energy that went into concocting far-fetched accusations could have gone into solving some real issues. I spent my 4 days off drawing a poster-sized montage of every WWF wrestler I could think of as a special send-off gift for Hulk. By all indications he'd be riding into the sunset after WrestleMania 8, heading for Hollywood. With his reputation as a hero to kids severely damaged and a ton of money in the bank, I didn't think he'd be back. Holding off steroids would leave him looking much too mortal. To me, Hulk, like Vince, had taken the business to its highest peaks, and seeing Hulk fading out without any glory seemed wrong. Stu, Helen, Georgia, Julie and all the kids came to Indianapolis for WrestleMania 8. Julie bitched constantly once she arrived, trying her hardest to ruin the entire experience for me. The higher my career went, the more my marriage bottomed out. Julie acted as if she resented my popularity. The night before WrestleMania 8 we wound up in a bar near the hotel with my red-headed Italian fan-turned-friend Carlo, who'd come down from Toronto. Vince's son Shane walked in. He was on the road doing various jobs, setting up the ring and refereeing, learning the business so that someday he could take over the reins from his dad. I'd always done my best to watch out for him, and he liked me for it. As he approached, a startled Julie jolted toward me. When he greeted me with a handshake, I smiled and said, "Let me introduce you to my wife." Shane turned beet red. There was an awkward silence. Julie seemed furious, and I had no idea why. Carlo whispered, "He just goosed Julie big time." Obviously Shane hadn't had a clue who she was. Shane quickly took a stool at the other end of the bar. I was inclined to forget it, but when I looked over at him, I noticed he was studying me with puzzled defiance. I thought, okay, he knows I know what he did and thinks that since his daddy owns me, I won't do anything. He was wrong. Because it was the night before a big match, I wasn't drinking. And Julie's foul mood had made me even more testy. I slammed my boss's kid against the wall, telling him through clenched teeth that if he ever touched my wife again, I'd rip his head off. I never would have hurt him, but I had to let him know I wasn't afraid of who he was. Then Carlo pried me away, Shane still protesting his innocence. The next day all the hearts crammed into a black stretch limo to go to my big match with Roddy. Stu was up front with my mom, and all of the rest of us were squeezed in back as fans screamed and surrounded the car. Blade, who was wearing a black miniature version of my ring jacket, looked like a tiny replica of me and was laughing hard as he slapped his little hands on the window. Beans told me she didn't want Roddy Piper to hurt me. She never liked watching me get beat up. Jade was 9 now and still riding herd on Dallas, who was at that age where he was starting to suspect that wrestling might not be real. I hoped they could forgive me someday, for being gone so much. As the limo pulled away, everybody was as excited as I was about my big match with Roddy, except for Julie. Backstage at the Hoosier Dome, I passed around the drawing I'd done for Hulk and made sure every wrestler signed it before I gave it to him. Hulk loved it. I wondered whether he'd ever be back. As I put on my gear, it dawned on me that I didn't get nervous for matches anymore. Even this one, where Roddy and I had planned that we were going to go against Vince's policy just this once. I was going to get a little juice. Our babyface match desperately needed it if we were going to steal the show. In a toilet stall, I carefully snipped and taped up my blade. With 68,000 fans in attendance and hundreds of thousands more watching at home on pay-per-view with VCRs going, 4 WWF cameras, not to mention all the wrestlers, I'd have to be a real pro to make the blood look accidental. When Roddy and I came nose to nose in the ring for the opening stare down, I had to look away or else I'd have cracked up. We'd worked a shoot, and the fans believed this match would be like no other, especially since the Hitman and Roddy Piper had never really worked before. The story built slowly, the wily veteran and the hungry kid giving no quarter. When the time was right, the ref stopped me and told me to fix my loose shoelace. While I leaned over to tuck it into my boot, Roddy blindsided me with a fist to the face, and I crumpled to the mat, covering up to spit the blade out of my mouth. Roddy kicked me several times in the face, never touching me. I cut a 1-inch slice right over my right eyebrow, deep enough to convince all the boys afterwards that it was the real deal or risk being exposed. At first the blood was barely noticeable, but soon my face was a mess. Soon enough, a crazed Piper had knocked the referee down and stood over me holding the ring bell high over his head as he prepared to brain me like a seal hunter delivering the final blow. He hesitated while I groped and clawed my way to my knees. With my head covered in blood, I gave Roddy my baby seal eyes. Roddy expertly milked it. Feigning a change of heart, he seemed to come to his senses just long enough to toss the bell out to the timekeeper in disgust. Pulling me to my feet, he blasted me with a punch. I leaned and swung back at him with a desperate, wild blow that he easily ducked under as he clamped me in his finishing move, the sleeper. The captivated crowd was hanging on every move. I spun toward the corner flailing for the top rope, but my escape was just out of grasp and I began to sink. Supported by Roddy, I jumped up and kicked off the top corner pad, knocking us both backwards with all my weight, crashing on top of Roddy, who couldn't use his arms to break his fall. It had to hurt, the way we landed with a thud. I rolled backwards holding his elbows tight. Piper was pinned beautifully. The ref came back to life on cue for the 1, 2, 3. With the crowd cheering loudly, Roddy gave me a hug, and I told him thanks cuz I'll never forget what you did for me today. Roddy said, "I love you, brother," and buckled the IC belt around my waist. Now for the real work. I came through the curtain pretending to be concerned that I was going to need stitches. Chief, Lanza and a bunch of the boys gathered around me to see how bad it was. Chief brushed my hair away. "Maybe a stitch, Brett, but you'll be all right." Roddy was there, concerned, apologizing, and we both knew we'd fooled them all. Little did we know that Flair and Randy, who went on right after us, had secretly planned to get juice too. Flair was so obvious as he cut himself repeatedly that when he came back with several long, bloody cat scratches on his forehead, an angry Vince fined them each $500 for blading. He never said a word to me because he thought that mine was legit. After WrestleMania 8 came 3 long days of TVs. My match with Piper not only stole the show, but many felt it saved the pay-per-view altogether. And so began my second reign as IC champion. 4 days later I was in Munich. I loved being back in Germany. As I rode on the bus down cobbled streets, I listened to my Walkman thinking about how in 1936 Hitler watched in disgust as the black American runner Jesse Owens sprinted to win the gold medal at the Berlin Olympics. I thought back to 1981 at my old Hanover days, with Jim, when I was the biggest loser of the tournament. "Well, Axel Dieter, you old pimp, take a look at me now." Fans were pounding on the sides of the bus for blocks before we finally pulled up to the back of the arena, where an even bigger crowd excitedly waited for us. Owen had told me I was really big in Germany, and judging by all the signs being held up, it appeared to be true. When I stepped off the bus, girls screamed and cried uncontrollably, some even fainting. In the dressing room, Chief told me I was the opening match. I argued that I was the Intercontinental Champion and that as I understood it, I was very popular in Germany, so it was therefore crazy for me to be first match. But Chief had his orders, so I did go out first. I think I made my point though. As soon as I came out, my music blaring, the sellout crowd exploded. Teenage girls overran barricades and leapt past security guards, who were helpless to stop them. They literally knocked me down, hugging and kissing me. I'd never seen or heard anything like it, not even for Hogan at the height of all his glory. Hulkamania was a phenomenon. but the reaction I got was more like Beatlemania. It wasn't just teenage girls, there were older women too, and even men and boys reached out to me. Flowers flew at me from everywhere, and boxes of chocolates, wrapped gifts, and lots of teddy bears. I gently pulled myself up, smeared with lipstick, and made my way through the crowd to the ring. I did my strut to all four sides, and the crowd exploded each time. When I dropped down to give my shades to a little girl, thousands of people sighed. As I got set to take on Dino Bravo, he said, "You're over, brother." They cheered for every move. As I sold, they chanted my name so loudly that I could barely hear myself think. When I beat Bravo, the place came totally unglued. Leaving the building was another frenetic scene. An astounded Chief met me at the top of the ramp. "You were right, Stu. They love you. I've never seen anything like that, ever." That night the hotel was overrun with Hitman fans, many of whom had camped out in the lobby. In Dortmund it was worse, if that's any way to say it. I loved it. The only other wrestler to get a huge response was The Undertaker, who was greeted everywhere. We went by hundreds of kids dressed in black with rings under their eyes. Then we stormed the UK in London, Birmingham, Sheffield and Glasgow. The reception was as incredible as in Germany. As I'd predicted, Vince had stumbled onto a gold mine. American wrestling was huge in Europe, and all the WWF wrestlers were household names.